From National Review headquarters in New York City, this is a Capital Writing author interview. Capital Writing is a new project of National Review Capital Matters, where we will be interviewing authors of recent econ books and talking to them about their ideas. This is an addition to the Capital Record podcast with David Bonson and the Capital Letter newsletter every Friday from Andrew Studiford. So we're excited to get this started, and our first guest is the one and only Samuel Gregg. Dr. Gregg is a distinguished fellow in political economy and a senior research faculty at the American Institute for Economic Research. He has a new book out that's called The Next American Economy, and that's going to be the topic of our discussion today. So thanks so much for being here, Sam. We appreciate it.
Dominic, it's good to be with you, and thanks to your viewers for listening.
Absolutely. Well, we've got The Next American Economy. That's the title of your book, and any reader that's going through will be struck that second word, that American, is a really important part of this title. Can you explain what it is about the U.S. in particular that you're trying to get across in this book?
Well, thanks, Dominic. You're right. That second word is extremely important, the next American economy. And I say that for a couple of reasons. One is the basic thesis of the book is that the United States is really facing, I think now, a choice between two economic models for the United States. So whatever happens in the rest of the world, we're facing a definite choice. One is between what I call state capitalism, which is something akin to European social democracy, but not quite the same. But it's basically the idea that you have markets, you have private property, you have free enterprise in these things, but the state is deeply involved in virtually every aspect of economic life, whether it's through tariffs and protectionism, whether it's through industrial policy, whether it's through mandating things like stakeholder capitalism through government agencies. That's one sort of choice that's facing us. The other choice, I think, is really a free market economy. But that I mean something very specific. I mean, obviously, free market exchange, competition, dynamic trade, creativity, entrepreneurship, etc. But I also argue it needs to be grounded in some very specific things about America, that being our founding and the sense of American identity that was forged there and how that still continues to influence the United States today. But also the idea of a commercial republic. This is an idea which emerged in a particular form during the founding period, and it includes all those things: entrepreneurship, competition, dynamic trade, but it also includes things like rule of law, constitutionally limited government. In an American context, it would obviously include something like a rich sense of federalism, but as well as things like what the founders would call Republican virtues. So there's a type of moral culture that goes along with that should certainly resonate with the founders and should still resonate for us today as Americans. So that's one reason why. The second reason why I use that word American is because, as you know, and as the readers of National Review's Capital Matters know, since 2015, at least on the right, we've been involved in a major internal argument about what should be the appropriate settings of American economic policy domestically and in terms of our outlook on the rest of the world. So it's not just that we're choosing state capitalism or free market economy properly understood. Americans themselves are having this debate about whether we move in the direction of economic nationalism, and there's plenty of people on the right who think that we should, and they have different versions of that, but that's more or less what they mean, as opposed to what I'm arguing for in the book, which is a market economy in the United States. Let's call it markets in America, an American political economy that takes into account and is deeply formed by all those truths that were brought forward and shaped and developed and really crystallized in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations and that subsequent tradition of economic thinking, and the way that that has and needs to continue working itself out in the United States. So those are the two main reasons why I use the word America.
Mm-hmm. And as viewers can probably tell by your accent, you're from Wisconsin, right? So
I'm from Australia,
yeah.
as you well know, my friend.
Uh-huh.
Although people think I'm from England because of my voice. But one of the things I will say is that some of the most remarkable insights into the United States have come traditionally in many respects from people who were not born here, who were not raised here.
Yeah,
I mean, the best example, of course, is Alexis de Tocqueville.
Uh-huh.
Right? And I cite him in the book because he noticed these things, this commercial dimension of America. Now, I am certainly not in Alexis de Tocqueville's class, but I can tell you that when I first moved to start to live in the United States, that commercial imperative was immediately obvious to me as someone from the outside. And that, is, it seems to me, is very distinctly American. It's very much the essence of much of our identity. And I think that's something we need to be building upon rather than looking to alternative traditions of economic thought that I don't think are consistent with the founding, but also, as we know in the case of things like not just social democracy, but something you and I have talked about, which is this problem of corporatism. That's deeply alien to, I think, the best of what the American economy is supposed to be about.
Yeah, and when we're looking at the state capitalism, you're set up state capitalism as sort of the alternative model to the American market system, which is slightly unusual because a lot of times people will set up, markets versus socialism, or free markets versus communism, or something like that. But I think you're onto something here, because in the United States we've never had a socialist, an explicitly socialist political party winning nationwide elections like we've seen in European countries. We've never seen that kind of buy-in at the grassroots level for socialism in this country, even though we have seen that in Europe at various points. And so this alternative of state capitalism, it's a term that's sometimes used to describe China's model, but you mean something much broader than that, right?
Yeah, so China does deploy a form of state capitalism. And when we talk about China opening itself up to the world, that's true. That certainly did occur. But we shouldn't forget that China and the Chinese state, by which I mean the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, and the Chinese military, has continued to have and is now accelerating its role in the Chinese economy. But that's a little different from what we see in the United States. By state capitalism, what I have in mind here are really what you would call the policies of economic nationalism, wrapped up with a very strong and active and interventionist state. We can call it the interventionist state, we could call it the regulatory state, and also the conviction. And this is something that is present on the left. It has been for a long time since the progressive era, but now is starting to manifest itself on the right. A certain faith in technocrats, a certain faith in experts, a faith in their ability to judge better than markets what are the more optimal economic outcomes in any given sector of the economy. That's what I really mean when I'm talking about state capitalism, American style. I mean, we see versions of this in some continental European countries. France is a very good example of this, right? Because they literally train every year a select number of people whose job is fully understood to be the technocrats who will do all the serious work politically and economically while the French political class battles it out on the political level. And the technocrats are really the people who are in charge. And that's very much the French economic tradition of capitalism. And there's some parallels there with what some people in America want to do in terms of this idea of state capitalism. It's not socialism. As you're right, we've never had a major socialist party come anywhere near to winning any national elections in the United States. There have been as social democratic mayors of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, as
That's
you
right.
will
That's
well know
exactly
and
right.
appreciate. But we don't have that tradition. Even social democracy, there are people like Bernie Sanders and others around who flirt with this term or use this term, and they really have in mind something like 1970s Sweden, for example, which of course no longer exists because Sweden cast off a lot of that model about 30 years ago. But state capitalism in the sense of economic nationalism, by which I mean protectionism, tariffs, industrial policy, plus regulatory and administrative state, plus a type of technocratic class, is really what I think is being put forward as the alternative to free markets American style.
Mm-hmm. And in addition to that tension in the book that you have between state capitalism and markets, you also have a tension between private interests and the general welfare. And you talk about how a lot of these policies that people will propose as being in the general welfare end up benefiting private interests. I always think that phrase, general welfare, which to modern ears sounds like some kind of a government handout or something, was actually intended, when the founders were writing it, to be a prohibition on anything that's only, it was supposed to be a restriction on government. It was supposed to say, look, government should be only looking out for the general welfare, not for the welfare of specific groups of people, and not to concentrate benefits in specific places. And so, but all throughout American history, as you note in the book, we've seen government do just that. They go through and they do benefit specific people. You say that industry should take pride in not asking for government protection. That's something that they should. That's just a norm that we need to adopt here in the U.S. And get better on. What do you think are some things that could help us to move in that direction so that companies aren't sitting around and spending all of their money lobbying, and instead they spend money actually providing things for their customers?
Well, let me respond by saying two things. I think this idea of the general welfare, as you described it, was the way it was understood by the framers, very similar to the type of argument you see advanced in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, right? Because he talks about the ways in which businesses pursue favors, which was very much part of the mercantilist system that existed at the time. And I often say Adam Smith was a great proponent of markets. He wasn't particularly a fan of businessmen, and they were men at the time, because he noticed this propensity on their part to go to the government, to get privileges, to get favors, literally licenses to do certain things in parts of the world which would exclude anyone else from engaging in the same type of activity. So I think that's very much part of this late 18th century outlook that Smith is articulating. I think that's at least partially influential on the way that the American founders thought about this. So we fast forward to today, and I think it's fair to say that cronyism is alive and well in large parts of the United States. I cite some different data showing that various counties in Washington or around Washington, D.C. are among the richest in the United States, and they literally produce nothing, right? They're there because they're there to lobby, they're there to acquire favors, they're there to forge links between legislators on one hand and private interest groups on the other. So we have to ask ourselves, how do we break this nexus up? And it seems to me there's two reasons. One is the one thing that you've already mentioned, which is it's a type of norm that American business leaders should take it as a point of pride that I do not go to the state to fix my problems. I am not here looking for favors. I'm not here looking for privileges. My job is to produce goods and services that customers want and need, and that's how I'm going to make money. That I think is it's a type of norm that I think they should adopt anyway. But we also know that incentives really matter, and incentives can be very powerful, especially in the sense that they can literally outweigh very strong moral norms to do the contrary. So in the case of the United States, if you want to deal with this problem of private interests capturing parts of the regulatory state. If you want to deal with this problem of people wanting to get close to government to get favors, then the way to do that is to shift the incentives away from government. And one way you do that is by reducing the size of the regulatory state. And I don't mean just size in terms of numbers. I mean the regulatory state and the administrative state's capacity to offer these favors and privileges in the first place. Because if a regulatory agency has nothing to give people, then private interests are not going to go to them, because if the regulator has nothing, literally can't do anything for them, then there's no incentive for the private interest, the business, the corporation to go there. There's no incentive for them to be in Washington, D.C. or wherever the particular lobby center happens to be. So I think by reducing the size and scope of government power, of reducing its capacity to offer these types of privileges, you can shift incentives away from the state and much more towards what markets are supposed to do, which is delivering goods and services for consumers. And I think it's really about what you might call, I use this phrase in the book, restoring consumer sovereignty. And you do that by reducing the capacity of private interests and regulators to scratch each other's backs.
Yeah, another area that you touch on in the book related to consumers is antitrust. And you hear a lot of talk today about the consumer welfare standard, which is how we've done antitrust for a while. And you hear people, both on the left and the right, arguing that we should get rid of that in favor of some alternative framework. It seems to me that if you're getting away from the idea that the purpose of business, as you said, is to provide products to customers that are paying for it, and if we adopt a different mindset of that when we're doing antitrust, I think that could cause some problems. So, what do you say about those calls for more antitrust? And you had some interesting facts too in the book about competitiveness in the American economy. And I believe you said that it is actually the case that there are very few sectors of the U.S. economy that are only dominated by a handful of companies. So in that sense, we're very competitive. But in another sense, we've become less competitive in that we actually have fewer, in total, fewer small businesses employing a smaller share of the economy than we did, say, 20, 30 years ago. So can you go into some of that?
Sure. Well, as you know, there's a significant move on both the left and the right to basically weaponize antitrust law to go after specific companies. And we're talking about two groups. One are big tech companies, as well as particular companies like Amazon, who some people would say have a monopoly. Now, I don't think they have a monopoly. I just think they are producing something that people want, and they're doing it much better until someone else comes along and can outcompete them, which will happen one day, by the way. That will happen one day. So that's one reason why people on the left and the right are calling for antitrust. They're also calling for antitrust because they don't like the politics being pursued by particular big tech companies. And, I'm not unsympathetic to that. I mean, I'm not a particular fan of Twitter or Facebook, and we've seen ways in which they've tried to weigh the scales when it comes to elections, and the way that they've blocked information, which is important for people to think about and to consume, so to speak. I'm sympathetic to that. But I don't think you deal with that problem by weaponizing antitrust, because once you move away from the consumer welfare standard, then antitrust law can and has been used in the past by powerful companies who've decided, I don't want to compete anymore. I just basically want to get rid of my competitors. And the ways I'm going to do that is by bringing antitrust suits against them. And that's happened in the past. Another thing about antitrust is that ultimately it tends to be pretty ineffective. So this was done with the telephone companies and communication companies, as you know, several decades ago. But what of course happened was that within a few years, most of these communication companies had basically put themselves back together again by engaging in contracts with one another. So there's a certain ineffectiveness to these tools as well. My view is that rather than relying upon antitrust to deal with some of these issues of competitiveness, the best things you can do is to ensure that regulation is as light as possible, that markets are as competitive and open as possible. Because we know, and someone we both know, Ryan Bourne at the Cato Institute has done a lot of very good research on this, showing how over time, if you have even relatively competitive markets, it's very hard for very big companies to maintain a dominant share of any one sector of the economy. So if you look at the Forbes top 100 companies 40 years ago and compare them to the top 100 companies today, it's a very, very different list. So even those companies that have tried to use regulation, that have tried to use antitrust to sort of push other competitors out or even stop them from coming into the marketplace, they haven't succeeded. And they won't succeed as long as there are relatively competitive markets, because all these companies know, and I say this in the book, all these companies know that all it takes is for one person with a particular new idea that completely changes the way things are done in a particular sector of the economy, and they're done. And there's literally nothing they can do about that. They operate on that assumption every single day. They're waiting for who's going to be the next Mark Zuckerberg or whatever the product is. It's going to basically render their industry or their way of doing their type of business redundant.
I think that's one of the problems that advocates of the market economy just we're sort of at a disadvantage in argumentation on that, because you're completely right. That's exactly what happens, but it puts us in the awkward position of we're arguing for things that don't exist yet, and they necessarily don't exist yet. It's not a problem, but proponents of industrial policy, say, will point to an actual existing industry and say, look, we can save this. The government can save this. Look at this concrete thing that already exists, that people are employed by, that people use. If we have the right people in charge, we can save that. And so I think it's a much more easy thing for people to wrap their minds around than this idea, which, like, again, we would both admit we have no idea what the next great innovation is going to be, and if we did, we'd be making we'd be millionaires, but we're not. And so, how does this? How do you get past that hurdle in arguing for markets instead of state capitalism?
Well, what you're pointing to, I think, is let's call it an intellectual problem, even a marketing problem to a certain extent, that free marketers have always faced. Because people who believe in markets are thinking always about the long term. That's our focus. Our focus is not this particular industry in this particular place and this particular time. Free marketers are taking the long-term view. We're looking in terms of things that are unknown to us now, but will materialize at some point in a form that we won't know, but will nonetheless revolutionize the way things are done at present. So it's reflected a little bit in the famous debates between Keynes and Hayek, right? Because Keynes, I think, was very focused upon immediate problems. We have this problem now, we have to fix it. And in the long term, we don't know what's going to happen, but I do know what's going to happen to this community now if we don't do something now. The problem with that is that it leads to a perpetual short-termism, both at the level of government policy, but also the way ordinary people think about, or ordinary or normal people, let's say, think about everyday economic life. So how do we counter this? Well, I happen to think that history is a very good way of doing this. And they don't have to be particularly complicated stories. We can talk about, for example, how the invention of the automobile put the horse and buggy industry out of business very, very quickly. We can talk about how air travel and the capacity to use planes to fly long distances suddenly changed the way in which the shipping industry operated, because no longer were most people traveling around the world on ship. You can do it by plane. So I think that looking historically and offering historical analyses of how these things have played out, like the example of the big businesses of 40 years ago being not so big now or completely non-existent, that's a way of opening up people's eyes to the longer term perspective and asking them to say, look, when you put your faith in markets to produce good outcomes, even if you don't know what that's going to look like, the historical evidence shows pretty conclusively that markets tend to come up with the type of unexpected changes that benefit everyone over the long term. So I think those types of historical examples, stories of how this has happened, and packaging them in ways that people can understand and get their minds around quickly is a way of dealing with that challenge that free marketers have always had when it comes to persuading people as to the veracity and the power of our ideas.
In addition to the historical perspective, there's also the international perspective. And before China was the big economic threat to the United States in conventional wisdom, it was Japan. And we saw how that turned out for Japan. They basically haven't seen significant economic growth in better part of 30 years now. Still a rich country, but a stagnant one. And we're seeing China right now in the face of higher interest rates and in the face of a lot of scaling back of their market reforms that they had done in previous decades. We're seeing them face some really significant problems. So what are the lessons that we can learn from our economic adversary of 30 years ago and our economic adversary now that can inform American decision-making so that we avoid those pitfalls?
Well, let's start with the first example you used, which was Japan. So I was a teenager in the late 1980s, and I remember very distinctly people telling me and lots of other people that Japan was the future. The Japanese economic model, which involved a great deal of industrial policy, was the future. We saw this in popular literature. We also saw it in films, right? Like Black Rain, Rising Sun, or even the first Die Hard film, right?
I was going to say Die Hard, yeah.
In the Nakatomi Tower, right? And so there was this sense that the Japanese way was the way forward. And as some very good people at the Mercator Center have pointed out, there were reams of books telling us that we had to become like Japan. And then at that very point in time, as you mentioned, the Japanese economy entered a period of 20 years of stagnation, which they've never really come out of in anything like the way that they should. And there were lots of reasons for that stagnation. Their population problem, in the sense that they're not having any children, that's a huge problem. Bad monetary policy decisions were part of the mix. But also it's very clear that the use of industrial policy, in fact, they had a entire ministry that was focused upon this, that was seen as one of the most powerful ministries in the Japanese government. It's very clear that this had disastrous effects pretty much everywhere these policies were tried. And it's also interesting that those parts of the Japanese economy that continued to prosper were precisely the ones that were not influenced by industrial policy. So the lesson of Japan is, do not be like Japan, as it was between roughly the early 1960s up until, well, in some respects, they've never really changed. I think they still do industrial policy up to a certain point, even though their own finance ministry in either 2001 or 2002 publicly said that the Japanese model was not the cause of our success. It was, in fact, the cause of our failure. So let's switch to China. Well, China, as you mentioned, did engage from 1978 onwards in some economic liberalization. That primarily involved gradually opening its markets to external investors, and traders, etc., including Americans. But we shouldn't kid ourselves. That liberalization was always relatively limited, and the Chinese government were managing that in a way so as to make sure that it never became such that they lost their grip on power, right? So I think that's a very important part of the story we need to tell. The second part of the story is that they never gave up on using state forms of development. In other words, pretty big and expansive industrial policy. After 2008 and the financial crisis in America, it's very clear that a lot of Chinese policymakers consciously looked at the American situation and said, well, if that's free market capitalism, we're not sure we want that. And really beginning then, and then continuing and accelerating in 2012, when Xi first came to power, Japan has been winding back that limited economic liberalization, so much so that fewer and fewer Chinese companies can be described as private enterprises. They're either fully state-owned enterprises or partly state-owned enterprises, or enterprises in which the most important person in the company is not the executive director or the CEO, it's whoever has the highest Communist Party membership card. So they've moved back in this more state-like direction, which, as I said, they never really gave up, but they've really pushed further down in that direction since 2012. And what's happened? Well, the growth has slowed dramatically. In fact, we also know that China is releasing fewer and fewer economic statistics for public access. And I think that's because they know that the statistics show that the growth is just not what it used to be. And so China, I would argue, is basically falling into that middle income trap, into which a lot of developing economies eventually fall. That's a trap whereby they have to move from things like comparative advantage in cheap labor, which has been their comparative advantage for a long period of time, which is now disappearing because they too have managed, thanks to the one-child policy, to inflict a demographic disaster upon themselves. But it means moving from that type of situation whereby you move towards high intensive capital formation. And they haven't managed to make that jump. In fact, very few countries do make that jump. And when they do so, it can be very, very difficult and painful. So China has moved down the path of a more expansive, more extensive state capitalism. And it's producing immense corruption, trillions of dollars, of US dollars in misallocated capital. It's producing cities where no one lives. It's producing severe dysfunctionalities in capital markets. It's also producing a situation whereby more and more foreign investors are simply leaving. They're simply leaving because one of the things about Chinese state capitalism is that private property rights and rule of law are not part of the picture. They're not, right? So if you're an American company or a European company in China and you're doing business with a Chinese company and there's a dispute that arises, you can't rely upon fair and impartial courts to settle the situation because the Chinese court will automatically rule in favor, in most cases, of the Chinese plaintiff. So this is costing China now because more and more foreign investment is leaving, foreign companies are getting out. And that can't be good for their future. And we shouldn't be surprised by this because they've moved in this direction of this very aggressive state capitalism, which in the end, I think, introduces enormous dysfunctionalities, which is why I find it so surprising that I see magazines and journals like American Affairs, or as I'm tempted to call it, Chinese Affairs, advocating the Chinese model as the way of the future, just as the Chinese model is starting to roll off the tracks.
Coming back to the U.S. now, you devote significant time in the book talking about ESG and about stakeholder capitalism, and you see those as being very much similar, a similar phenomenon, and all of that, in your view, fits under the umbrella of corporatism. And corporatism is a word that kind of doesn't sound like what it actually means. I think if you say it, it kind of sounds like corporations are running the government, but that's not really what you mean by this. It's corporatism is where the government and corporations are basically are more closely overlapping with each other than they would be in a true market economy where those are two separate spheres. So, what is the threat you see from corporatism, and then ESG as that relates to that, and what do you see as the way to prevent that from further entrenching itself in the American economy?
Well, corporatism has very deep roots, some of which actually go back to the medieval period, but its more modern conceptions were developed by mainly Western European thinkers, including prominent German economists and thinkers of the late 19th century, as well as French thinkers like Émile Durkheim. But corporatism in this sense, basically, the word corporate in this sense comes from the Latin corpus, which means body. And the idea of corporatism is you have this body of business, you have this body called the government, and you have these bodies called unions. And the idea is that they work together cooperatively, guided by the government. And it's really, you're not throwing out private property, you're not throwing out competition completely, but everything is heavily managed from the top down. So what matters in this type of economic situation is not competition, but what they see as coordination or top-down coordination. Competition is seen as something that's destabilizing, and it's the heavy emphasis upon forming a consensus of views, having a type of stability in every part of the economy. And the state sort of presides as a sort of benign director of everything. So if you're looking for examples of what it looks like, you can talk about hard corporatism and soft corporatism. Hard corporatism would be something like fascist Italy, right? Or Franco's Spain up until around about 1955. Soft corporatism is things like worker co-determination arrangements and work councils, as we see in many European countries today. Corporatism, by the way, had a major impact upon the New Deal. If you look at some of the legislation, such as the National Recovery Act, the NRA, you can see very much corporatist ideas and thinking written into the act itself. And you even had people like Roosevelt, FDR, praising the ideas, the economic ideas of Mussolini. You even need just look at some of the architecture around Washington, D.C., that's reflected in some of these New Deal projects. It's all sort of rather fascistic types of statues and buildings. So that's corporatism, and it has had an impact in the United States, particularly during the New Deal period. Stakeholder capitalism, as it's called today, operates along quite similar lines insofar as it thinks about groups, so unions, businesses, NGOs, working together to produce particular outcomes that are determined in advance by these groups, arriving at some sort of consensus and then setting out objectives. And it involves the idea that everyone has a stake in the business or what's going on, so much so that different representative groups have a right, quote unquote, to have representation on boards of advisors or even boards of corporations when it comes to businesses paying attention to and even incorporating what are regarded as their stakeholders. So this results in all sorts of problems. Collusion, it upsets the balance in terms of who's responsible for what, because when you have employees on boards, they're not going to be thinking so much about profit. They're going to be thinking about the stability of their jobs, right? So that's a natural thing that they would do. There's a reason why we divide these responsibilities up. Stakeholder capitalism also allows complacent CEOs off the hook because they can say, well, you know, we could produce a profit or more profit, but because we have these greater responsibilities to the body politic, to the environment, to global world peace, I'm exaggerating slightly, but not much, that's why we don't have quite as much profit. And you shareholders should just be frankly happy that we're paying attention to you at all. ESG is one of the ways in which I think many people who are advocates of stakeholder capitalism, the way that they think that you realize this is by mandating these sorts of ESG requirements upon companies so that profit sort of becomes one of several concerns or several goals that businesses are supposed to be pursuing. Now, I could give you chapter on verse and all the different problems with ESG. And you and I have talked about that on many occasions. But if we want to deal with this problem, it seems to me that one of the fundamental things we need to do is to recognize that every organization has, to use an Aristotelian term, its own telos. So the military's telos is to defend the country and fight wars. The telos of a church or a synagogue or a mosque is to worship God in a particular way. The telos of a family is to have children, to have marriages, and things like that. The telos of business is to make profit and create shareholder value. That's what defines the nature of the business. Now, that doesn't give it a warrant for engaging in a wanton environmental destruction or paying no attention to the circumstances around you. That's certainly not the case. But it is an argument to say that you do not put the environment or you do not put global world happiness as one of your goals. You focus on this particular telos because it's through doing business, through pursuing profit and developing and growing shareholder value, that is how business contributes to what some people would call the common good or the general welfare. It's precisely through business doing what it's supposed to do that it contributes to the well-being of all. Because when it produces profit and shareholder value, it grows wealth, it creates wages, it creates jobs. All those things enable us to do all sorts of things, whether it's educate our children, go on vacation, read books we wouldn't otherwise be able to buy, etc. So that, I think, is how we best counter this problem of stakeholder capitalism, which, as we've said, has some of these deeper roots in this corporatist type of thinking. But that, I think, requires a lot of businesses and business leaders and entrepreneurs to have a certain self-confidence about the goodness of what they do, instead of thinking of profit and shareholder value as somehow useful, but ultimately somehow disreputable activities.
Yeah, and going back to Tocqueville, as we mentioned at the beginning, a key part of American life is that we have so many civic associations and we have so many groups of people that can pursue those other goals that aren't profit, that can pursue environmental protection, that can animal welfare, things like that, which are really important. But it's important too that it stays, that each organization understands what its purpose is and stays on that.
I mean, think of it this way. No one would say that the job of the military is to raise a family.
Yeah.
No one would say that the job of a family is to wage war, right? So when you start to think about this, or even a nonprofit, the purpose of a nonprofit, an NGO, is not to pursue profit. So when you think about it that way, you say, well, of course, yes, that's absolutely right. So when you apply it to business, the conclusion you quickly reach is, well, this is what business does. It pursues profit and shareholder value, which is why it's not a family, which is why it's not the army, which is why it's not an NGO. And stakeholder capitalism threatens to throw all of that up in the air, and everyone will suffer as a consequence of that in the long term, because it will mean a lot less growth, it'll mean a lot of organizational confusion, and it will result effectively in major businesses being turned into just another NGO.
Mm-hmm. So, biggest takeaway I got from your book, which was really refreshing reading it, is that it ends on a pretty optimistic note. I mean, you are dealing with some really, really serious issues that pose significant threats to economic growth for years to come, but you retain this confidence that the United States can solve these issues, can move forward in a more productive way, and you reject a lot of the sort of defeatism mentality that I think we see from a lot of people, where it's either, oh, well, the U.S. has to just be some other country, and we just need to kind of, assume our role as as just another of the 200 countries out there, or this idea that America at its root is actually bad and is actually something that needs to be changed or destroyed. And you reject both of those, and I think it's really really encouraging to hear that. But why is it ultimately that you have that confidence in the United States to overcome these challenges and be able to prosper in the future?
I have two reasons. One is the American people, since they came together as one, so to speak, has shown a remarkable capacity to overcome obstacles that at the time seemed insurmountable. And we have a capacity also to go back and refresh ourselves and remind ourselves of what America is supposed to be about. And that's something that maybe it's because I was born outside this country, but most countries don't have that. Most countries do not have a set of documents, debates, historical events, personalities that we collectively call the American founding, that we can go back to and say, this is who we are, this is what we're supposed to be. And fundamentally, it's not about ethnicity, it's not about religion, it's not about a type of the type of reference points that many European countries naturally enough use when it comes to defining themselves. Our identity, as the American historian Gordon Wood, who's not a conservative, by the way, he's more or less a sort of modern liberal historian, but he makes the point, I think, very convincingly, that what gives America its identity and its distinctiveness are these ideas, debates, and documents and personalities from the founding period. That is what lots of Americans still look back to when we're asking questions about, well, how do we go forward in a way that's consistent with our history and our founding principles? It's also the reason, by the way, why groups like the 1619 Project are desperately trying to tear these things down, because they know that once you tear that down, then America is just another of whatever number of countries there are in the world, and our fate is to be nothing more than just another Western European social democracy. But the power of those ideas that lie at the heart of the American experiment in ordered liberty, they are particular in the sense that they were brought together at a particular time in a particular place and have shaped our particular country, but they're also ideas of universal import. So the idea of ordered liberty is not something that's simply just an American thing. It's something that all peoples are capable of, but we have been blessed that this has been made so much part of who we are as a country in a way that no other country can come close to claiming. The more we look back at that, the more we look, for example, at the Federalist Papers and the type of political economy that's expressed there, or my favorite of the founding documents, which is Washington's farewell address, the vision of political economy that shines through there is of America as a commercial society, a commercial republic in which entrepreneurship and economic creativity flourishes, in which economic competition binds the country together, and in which America is looking out and has a dynamic trade relationship with the rest of the world. And it's ultimately a deeply optimistic document, and that is far preferable to what I think you accurately describe is the defeatism that has entered so much of the American body politic on the left a long time ago, but unfortunately, we find it now on parts of the right as well.
That's right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Gregg, for your time. This was a wonderful conversation. To those of you watching out there, you should definitely check out Dr. Gregg's book. It's called The Next American Economy. It's out right now. It's with Encounter Books, and it's the sort of book that you should read, but it's also the sort of book that every American political leader should read as well, for some advice on how to get us out of economic stagnation and move us back on the track to prosperity.